for the yeas. I'd just ask for a voice vote. Okay, I'm told that we're not in that procedure in which to do it. So, Madam President, I have offered the amendment. It is laid down, and we will deal with it appropriately. I yield the floor.
The clerk.
And I ask suggest the absence of a quorum.
The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Akaka.
Madam President, do I understand correctly that we are now speaking on morning business?
We're in a quorum call.
I ask the quorum call be vitiated.
Without objection.
Thank you very much, Madam President. As a native Californian, I come to the floor now to honor the 100th birthday of President Ronald Reagan. Former First Lady Nancy Reagan asked that I serve on the Ronald Reagan Centennial Commission, and I was very honored to accept. Today, I join Senator Jim Webb, also a member, and Orrin Hatch, to continue President Reagan's spirit of bipartisanship. And we have invited senators on both sides of the aisle to join us here on the floor. From Simi Valley, in his beloved California, to our nation's capital, Americans this month are honoring President Ronald Reagan. These centennial events are intended to reach all Americans, including many born after President Reagan left office. Those who remember Ronald Reagan as governor or as president know how he impacted history. But there are some who may not realize that the society we live in today is in part due to the policies of President Reagan. Young adults today grow up without the fear of nuclear war in the back of their mind. And students of tomorrow will work to achieve President Reagan's dream of a world without nuclear weapons. It can be said that every great president can be remembered in just one sentence. Some sentences, he freed the slaves. Others, he made the Louisiana Purchase. Yet, 22 years after he left office, and 7 years after his death, the name Ronald Wilson Reagan can still provoke a complex debate. There is no one phrase that can describe his legacy. Some come to mind: the great communicator, or Mr. Gorbachev, tear down that wall. That's the one that does it for me. There is much debate over President Reagan because we all think of him differently. And over time, history sweetens our memories. But no matter what policy disagreements you may have had with him, you have to admire his style of politics. He was a conservative Republican, but he understood that in order to get anything done, he had to work across the aisle, which he did. In his 1983 State of the Union address, President Reagan said, and I quote, "Let us, in these next 2 years, men and women of both parties, every political shade, concentrate on the long-range, bipartisan responsibilities of government, not the short-range or short-term temptations of partisan politics," end quote. Also, Ronald Reagan had common-sense convictions that helped his achievements. He was a true gentle person, a gentle man in American politics. You would not have seen him giving a speech like some do today, calling his opponents names or giving out generalized insults. Dignity and wit were his weapons of choice. Also, President Reagan served during times of divided government, when one party had the White House and the other controlled at least one chamber of Congress, giving each side some governing responsibility to find solutions. It was a time when a financial and fiscal crisis brought the two parties together to compromise on tough choices about taxes and spending. In 1983, President Reagan and Speaker Tip O'Neill came together to compromise on Social Security based on proposals from a commission led by Alan Greenspan. And President Reagan is credited with creating the conditions that led to the end of the Cold War, reviving the economy and returning a sense of optimism to our country. One of the things I most admired was his work to reduce the number of nuclear weapons in the world, and his dream of a world one day free of these awful weapons. President Reagan expressed this vision during his second inaugural address on January 21, 1985. He declared, quote, "We seek the total elimination one day of nuclear weapons from the face of the earth," end quote. It was a remarkable statement from a president who had deployed tactical nuclear missiles in Europe to counter the Soviet Union's fearsome SS-20 missile fleet. But President Reagan understood the grave threat that nuclear weapons pose to humanity, and he boldly set himself to achieve their eventual elimination. My good friend George Shultz, Secretary of State under President Reagan, remembers that many at that time thought the President's initial negotiations to reduce strategic arms were not serious, even quite ridiculous. A classified report released recently showed that President Reagan asked the Joint Chiefs of Staff about the cost of an all-out Soviet attack and plans for retaliation. He asked Secretary Shultz, and I quote, "What's so good about keeping the peace after wiping each other out?" End quote. Mr. Shultz believes if he were around today, President Reagan would have been in favor of the New START treaty. At the famous Reykjavik summit with Soviet President Mikhail Gorbachev in October 1980, President Reagan went far beyond Gorbachev's proposal to slash strategic arms by 50%. He truly believed we should go to zero. The Reykjavik talks may not have worked out, but the idea that we should create a world free of nuclear weapons still endures to this day. Secretary Shultz thinks President Reagan would want to be remembered for his complete faith in freedom and his conviction that you have to be strong to defend that freedom. And that is certainly true. Ronald Reagan came into office with character and charisma, traits that take other elected officials years to develop. It was that charisma which impressed California's Republicans and led to his nomination as governor of my great state. Ronald Reagan was elected governor of California in 1966 by nearly a 1 million vote margin. He was elected to a second term in 1970. He did not seem to mind that people underappreciated him at the time. And decades later, as volumes of his handwritten essays were released to the public, Americans saw just what a thoughtful and visionary man he was. If we remember Ronald Reagan with one sentence, let us remember him as one who took big ideas and a crafting of words and a conviction of freedom to change the entire world. On the 100th anniversary of the birth of the great communicator, I hope we can embody his spirit of bipartisanship to keep our country strong and united today. Thank you, Madam Chairman. I yield the floor.
Madam President.
The senator from Texas.
Madam President, I rise to speak also on the 100th anniversary of the birth of Ronald Reagan, and I am so pleased to follow my colleague from California who has been under the weather for a little while, and we're very glad that she is back. Madam President, I think all of us will have an opportunity to talk about one of the great presidents of the last century and to mark the 30 years since Ronald Reagan's inauguration. When Ronald Reagan was elected president in 1980, America faced an anemic economy, high unemployment, and a sense of malaise emanated from Washington. But President Reagan never doubted America's potential was unlimited. During his second inaugural address, he said, "America can outproduce, outcompete, and outsell anybody, anywhere in the world." The Reagan Revolution was fueled by the understanding that given the opportunity, Americans would dream, create, and build. He also knew that the road to greatness was through an individual's effort, not through expanded government. So President Reagan set about reinvigorating the stagnant economy. He cut government spending. He reduced government regulation. He ended the practice of wage and price controls. He passed tax cuts for all Americans. He famously noted that government's first duty is to protect the people, not run their lives. The American economy responded with sustained growth. A new era of economic prosperity had been ushered in. Reagan's vision of the greater good also extended beyond our shores. He was a fierce advocate for freedom. With our Cold War adversary, the Soviet Union, imposing the tight grip of communism on much of the world, President Reagan launched a resurgence of American military might through the Strategic Defense Initiative. As he said, "Of the 4 wars in my lifetime, none came about because the United States was too strong." It was his firm resolve to negotiate from a position of strength that led to successful arms talks with the Soviets and ultimately to the downfall of the Soviet Empire. During his first inaugural address, he clearly stated where America stood. As for the enemies of freedom, he said, those who are potential adversaries, they will be reminded that peace is the highest aspiration of the American people. We will negotiate for it, sacrifice for it. We will not surrender for it, now or ever. President Reagan understood that all people, regardless of where they live, long for liberty and freedom. He believed that America was a beacon of hope to all the oppressed people of the world, a shining city on the hill, as he described it. As Jeffrey Bell wrote in the Weekly Standard, Ronald Reagan believed that people all over the world craved self-government just as much as Americans did. Even today, he is still being proven right. He said, "Concentrated power has always been the enemy of liberty." These words still echo in today's tumultuous times. We witnessed the poignant photographs of women in Iraq voting and joyously holding up their purple-stained thumbs. We are seeing marches in Egypt of people who long to be able to vote for the first time in a real election in 30 years. He also understood the importance of information in promoting freedom, calling it the oxygen of the modern age. It seeps through the walls, he said. It's topped by barbed wire. It wafts across the electrified borders. His words are as true today as when he uttered them. Freedom and individual liberty are America's greatest assets. They are the core of our national identity. They are the foundation of our economic prosperity. And these precious assets have been protected by the service and sacrifice of patriots in every generation from the beginning of America's history to today. Ronald Reagan understood and appreciated the duty we all have to preserve these American ideals. As he said, democracy is worth dying for, because it is the most deeply honorable form of government devised by man. When President Reagan died in 2004, there was a spontaneous worldwide outpouring of grief and tribute that caught some seasoned political pundits by surprise. Throughout his political career, Ronald Reagan was underestimated by establishment political intellectuals of the day. He was dismissed sometimes by the media. But when he spoke, the American people listened, they understood, and they agreed with this down-to-earth but very profound man. And so did the world. We all remember him fondly and with great respect and are honored to have known him. Madam President, I yield the floor.
Madam President.
The senator from Oregon.
Madam President, in just a few minutes we will have the very appropriate recognition for the late President Reagan. I just want to take a quick minute or two to talk about an amendment that will be called up later in the afternoon on my behalf to expand and improve the unmanned aerial systems, what's known as UAS programs that are part of the Federal Aviation Administration reauthorization bill. My amendment is Amendment 27. I want to thank Chairman Rockefeller and his staff because they've worked very closely with me on this and several other amendments. Growth in the unmanned aerial systems sector of the aviation business has been extraordinary in just the last few years. I think it's well known that these systems are proving critical to military operations in Iraq and Afghanistan. But they also have tremendous potential in the civilian sector, whether it's for firefighting, law enforcement, border control, search and rescue, or environmental monitoring. Law enforcement uses for this technology would be especially helpful in rural areas like much of my home state in Oregon. Unfortunately, the Federal Aviation Administration has not yet been able to come up with a real plan for how to integrate these unmanned aerial system vehicles into our airspace. So that's why I'm pleased that the Rockefeller bill before us includes requirements for FAA to get to work on a plan in this area and to establish test sites for unmanned aerial systems research. The bill, however, includes only 4 of these sites. I would like to see us be bolder, particularly in an area where I think there is so much opportunity for innovation, development, and job creation. So this amendment would expand the number of sites to 10, which would require the FAA to explore the most useful and safest way for unmanned aerial systems to be integrated into the airspace. The amendment would require at least one of these test sites investigate how unmanned aerial systems can be useful in monitoring public lands. As the chairman of the Subcommittee on Public Lands and Forests, I've heard repeatedly from law enforcement officials that remote public lands are too often being used as a place for criminals to grow drugs without detection. The Bureau of Land Management and Forest Service, 2 agencies that work in this field, simply don't have the resources to use expensive helicopters and do all the work that is necessary to root out the illegal operations. Let me conclude by saying that I believe unmanned aerial systems could be a cost-saving way to address this problem, and by getting the ball rolling with this amendment, I believe it will be possible to more significantly fight these reprehensible drug operations that are taking place on public lands. I'm hopeful this amendment, Amendment 27, will be accepted as part of the Rockefeller legislation. I look forward to working with the bill's managers to encourage development in a sector that I think is right at the heart of what we need to do to promote innovation in the aviation field. I thank Chairman Rockefeller. I see Senator McCain here, and I'm very pleased that the Senate is moving now to take time to recognize the extraordinary contributions of our late President Ronald Reagan. Thank you, Madam President. I yield the floor.
This order, the Senate will proceed to morning business until 3 p.m., with senators permitted to speak up to 10 minutes each for the purpose of giving remarks relative to the upcoming President Ronald Reagan.
Madam President, there are many of us who will come to the floor this afternoon to pay tribute to one of the great presidents in American history, and many of us will recollect times and experiences and contacts we had with President Reagan and the way he inspired us personally as well as a nation. When I was a prisoner of war in North Vietnam, the Vietnamese went to great lengths to restrict the news from home to the statements and activities of prominent opponents of the war in Vietnam. They wanted us to believe that America had forgotten us. They never mentioned Ronald Reagan to us or played his speeches over the camp loudspeakers. No matter. We knew about him. New additions to our ranks told us how the governor and Mrs. Reagan were committed to our liberation and our cause. When we came home, all of us were eager to meet the Reagans, to thank them for their concern. But more than gratitude drew us to them. We were drawn to them because they were among the few prominent Americans who didn't subscribe to the then fashionable notion that America had entered her inevitable decline. We prisoners of war came home to a country that had lost a war in the best sense of itself, a country beset by social and economic problems, assassinations, riots, scandals, contempt for political, religious, and educational institutions gave the appearance that we had become a dysfunctional society. Patriotism was sneered at, the military scorned, and the world anticipated the collapse of our global influence. The great, robust, confident republic that had given its name to the last century seemed exhausted. Ronald Reagan believed differently. He possessed an unshakable faith in America's greatness, past and future, that proved more durable than the prevailing political sentiments of the time. And his confidence was a tonic to men who had come home eager to put the war behind us and for the country to do likewise. Our country has a long and honorable history. A lost war or any other calamity should not destroy our confidence or weaken our purpose. We were a good nation before Vietnam, and we are a good country after Vietnam. In all of history, you can't find a better one. Of that, Ronald Reagan was supremely confident, and he became president to prove it. His was a faith that shouted at tyrants to tear down this wall. Such faith, such patriotism requires a great deal of love to profess, and I will always revere him for it. When walls were all I had for a world, I learned about a man whose love of freedom gave me hope in a desolate place. His faith honored us, as it honored all Americans, as it has honored all freedom-loving people. Let us honor his memory, especially today, by holding his faith as our own. And let us, too, tear down walls to freedom. That is what Americans do when they believe in themselves. Mr. President, I suggest the absence of quorum.
Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Akaka.
Senator from Alabama.
I ask that the quorum call be dispensed with.
Without objection.
And would note that I was honored to be able to hear Senator McCain's comments on Ronald Reagan. This Sunday is indeed the 100th anniversary of his birth. It was an opportunity for the whole nation to honor the memory of a man who honored us with his leadership. In the 1980s, we were a weakened country. Inflation and unemployment were in double digits. The hostage crisis in Iran dragged on with no end in sight. Our standing abroad was waning, and so too was our military strength. Challenges at home were answered with one failed Washington program after another. We had lost confidence in our future and really in the principles that made us exceptional. Ronald Reagan changed that. Part of that change began with 12 simple but crucial words. Government is not the solution to our problems. Government is the problem. And it is a big part of our problems. He stirred the passions of our country, revitalizing not only our economy but our identity and confidence as free people. What some have called the Reagan Revolution, he called the Great Rediscovery. He instilled us with a new confidence in our future and in America's role as the last best hope of mankind. His achievements are well known, but they bear repeating. Working with Paul Volcker, chairman of the Federal Reserve, he tamed the inflation which was robbing Americans of their life's work and savings. It was a tough course, a tough road. But he saw it through, he stayed on the course, and we were stronger as a result, and we need to get on a tough road and stay the course today. He lowered taxes dramatically, including a reduction in the top rate from nearly 80%, and he reined in a runaway bureaucracy that had trapped innovation and productivity in a labyrinth of regulation and red tape. His faith in the free market was not misplaced. It rewarded us. He created 20 million new jobs, grew our gross national product by 26%, and began the longest peacetime boom in our history. Conditions improved for Americans in every walk of life. The net worth of families earning between $20,000 and $50,000 rose by 27%. Reagan's stunning success debunked every myth of those who believe a bigger government is more compassionate and can do more for more people. The growth and potential productivity of the private sector is what has made America the most prosperous nation. And this success at home was matched by his success abroad. He defended our principles and our way of life with clarity, confidence, and vigor. His policies brought down the Soviet empire. Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall. Still resonates in our minds. And it liberated untold millions. Now today, more than 20 years after Reagan left office, we find ourselves facing many of the same challenges. A sagging economy, a growing government, and a diminished standing in the world. And we would be wise to remember the lessons of that era. Peace through strength, prosperity through freedom. He understood that our future greatness lies in the same place it always has, through our pioneering, restless, enterprising spirit that is filled with ambition and excitement and a deep sense of honor and decency that defines who we are as a people and who we will be tomorrow. In President Reagan's farewell address, he issued a word of caution: if we forget what we did, we won't know who we are. I am warning of an eradication of that, of the American memory that would result ultimately in an erosion of the American spirit, he said. So we face the dawning and defining challenges of our time, and as we do so, I hope we'll look back to the leadership he provided. Mr. President, just on a personal note, I was tremendously honored to have been appointed United States Attorney in the Southern District of Alabama by President Reagan in 1981. It was an office that I had served as an assistant in a number of years before, and to be able to come back and to lead that office was such a personal thrill. And, you know, the President didn't give me any directions exactly what we were to do, but I absolutely knew, and I've often said it's a great example of true leadership. I knew exactly what he wanted me to do. And I gathered the staff, many of whom I had worked for from years before, and used these words. I said, President Reagan sent me here to prosecute criminals and protect the United States Treasury. And I believe that's what he did. I believe that was implicit in his campaign, his consistent leadership, that he believed in law and order and efficiency. He wanted us to fight corruption and to try to help produce a more efficient government. I remember in those days that we went to a United States Attorney's Conference that I attended with my good friend, recently the Deputy Attorney General of the United States, Larry Thompson, and we would share rooms on the trips to save money because we knew and believed President Reagan wanted us to save money, and that our spending was out of control and we had a serious financial problem. Our budgets were frozen, but we worked harder and we produced more. That can be done today. This whining that we can't reduce spending, and many times they define reducing spending, is a reduction of the projected rate of growth. It's not even a reduction of current level of spending. These kind of things happen throughout the government. It increased productivity of our government. It reduced the take of the federal government from the private economy. The private economy grew, and the governmental sector became more efficient and more productive. That's what we need to return to. It was such a fabulous honor to have the opportunity to serve in that position, and I hope that I was faithful to the values that the President who appointed me had. I got to tell you, I think I knew what they were, and I know I gave my best effort to be worthy of the trust he placed in me, and I think that was true of many, many more people throughout the federal government. I would note the absence of a quorum and yield the floor.
Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Akaka.
Mr. President.
Senator from Georgia.
Mr. President, I rise for a moment to join my other colleagues in paying tribute to Ronald Reagan, President of the United States, super conservative.
The senator should be aware we're in a quorum call.
I would ask the unanimous consent the quorum call be dispensed with.
Without objection, so ordered.
Thank you,
Senator
Mr. President. Mr. President, I rise to join many of my other colleagues in paying tribute to the late Ronald Reagan, President of the United States, and a great conservative leader of our country and an inspiration to many, many, many Americans. I want to dedicate my remarks to a lady named Kathy Miller. Kathy works for me here in Washington. She has loved Ronald Reagan since the day he came on the scene, and it probably can quote him verbatim much better than I can. but he had a big, meaningful impact on her life, and I dedicate these remarks to her today. And my speech is going to be about two events that I happened to attend where Ronald Reagan was president, and the impact of those events not only on me, but on everybody else that was there, and actually on the future of our country. One took place in 1975 when he was beginning his pursuit for the nomination for the presidency of the United States. Gerald Ford was still President of the United States at that time and was running for the nomination for a full term. Ronald Reagan came to Cobb County, Georgia. Now, Cobb County, Georgia is where I live. It's a very Republican county right now, but in 1975, it was not a very Republican county. In fact, there was only one elected official in the entire county that was a Republican out of literally 100 or more who were Democratic officials. Ronald Reagan came to the Civic Center in Cobb County, and an unanticipated thing happened. Not by plan, certainly not by generation by politicians, but a crowd so large came that the fire marshal shut the building down. Now, this is a very good-sized 4,000-seat auditorium. People came to hear a positive message about America. I was fortunate enough, because I had been in politics a little bit, to be able to get in that room and listen to his speech. In 1975 in America was not the most prosperous of times. In fact, a lot of the things we've been suffering through the last couple of years we went through in 1974 and 1975. A difficult housing market, higher interest rates, higher unemployment, things of that nature. And this former actor came to Cobb County and lit a fire under everybody, not necessarily about him, but about ourselves. He uplifted people who needed uplifting, and he did it with a message of belief in ourselves, belief in our country, pride in America, defense through strength, those messages that were so clear of Ronald Reagan. It inspired me. It inspired me so much that I hoped he would get that nomination and would be elected President of the United States. But he failed. He did not get the nomination. Ultimately, Gerald Ford got it, and Ronald Reagan didn't get it. But he didn't go home and pout. He did not participate. He didn't drop out. He set his sights on the 1980 Republican nomination for President of the United States. And his history is recorded. He achieved it. He won it. And it was 8 great years for our country. 8 great years by a man who could inspire and who could lead. I've oftentimes said that two of the truly great presidents that we've had, John Kennedy and Ronald Reagan, both had something in common. They were from different parties. But first, they could stand before a group of people and make a speech about a subject they didn't agree with, and by the time they finished, they got a standing ovation. They were great communicators. Second, they were committed to a safe and prosperous America. They were hawks on defense. They confronted our enemies straight up, just like President Kennedy did with Khrushchev and just like President Reagan did. And then third, and most importantly, they reduced taxes and brought prosperity to the economy of the United States. The second occasion that I met Ronald Reagan was an interesting occasion. It was in the Omni Coliseum in Atlanta, where professional basketball was played at the time. Seats 16,000 people. I was then the minority leader of the Georgia House of Representatives and got elected to be the MC of a program that featured Senator Mac Mattingly, who was running for re-election from Georgia. But the keynote was a speech from Ronald Reagan. In fact, he flew from Washington to Atlanta to make that speech and then went on to Reykjavik, Iceland, where he confronted Gorbachev and Brezhnev and the Russians, and he stood for peace through strength and a strong buildup of American forces so that we would be a strong country that could defend ourselves, not a weak country that could be subservient to anyone else. And in that auditorium of 16,000 people, he stood up before them, and he again did the same thing he did in that auditorium in 1975. He inspired them to believe in their country. He inspired them to believe in what was right. He inspired them to peace through strength. And when he left, everybody was uplifted. And I think when Ronald Reagan left the presidency in 1988, we would all agree our country was uplifted. It was a period of prosperity. It was a period of strength. It was a renaissance of the American spirit. That is a test of true leadership. So I'm honored and privileged to join many of my colleagues on the floor today and pay tribute to the memory and the commitment of Ronald Reagan, President of the United States. And, Mr. President, I suggest the absence of a quorum.
Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Akaka.
Mr. President.
Senator from Virginia.
Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent that the call of the quorum be terminated.
Without objection, so ordered.
Thank you, Mr. President. I'd like to join my other colleagues who have come to the floor at this time to speak in honor of our late President Ronald Reagan on the occasion of his 100th birthday. I'd like to first begin by giving my best wishes to Mrs. Reagan and wish her all the best for her continued health, and also to say that as someone who had 3 different positions in the Reagan administration, I'm thinking of a lot of very fine people with whom I had the opportunity to serve, and especially Cap Weinberger, who I met and worked with every day for about 4 years, who was one of the finest people I've ever worked with, and also of John Harrington, who was the Director of White House Personnel, who first brought me into the Reagan administration and later served our country as Secretary of Energy. As I mentioned, Mr. President, I had 3 different positions in the Reagan administration, first as a member of the National Advisory Committee, and then spent 4 years to the day in the Pentagon as Assistant Secretary of Defense and then as Secretary of the Navy. And it was truly an inspiring time in my life to have worked for an individual who had the leadership qualities that Ronald Reagan demonstrated. He knew how to inspire our countrymen. He knew how to bring strong personalities together to work toward the good of the country and for its future. He knew how to make decisions. He knew how to make hard decisions, and one of the great qualities that he had was that he was never afraid to take responsibility for the consequences of any of those decisions. And that is something that motivated, I think, everyone who served in his administration. If we go back to that time period, those of us who were of age, 1980, it was a bad time in this country. Our country was in tremendous turmoil. We were demoralized in the wake of the fall of South Vietnam and the bitterness that had affected so many of us along class lines, particularly between those who had opposed the Vietnam War and those who had fought it, and what we were going to do in terms of resolving those issues here in the country and the impact that it had on our reputation internationally. Inflation was rampant. Sometimes in the high teens. People were saying that the presidency was too big of a job for any one person. Our military was overworked, underpaid, and dramatically underappreciated. I had friends with whom I had served or I had gone to the Naval Academy with who had gone into the Navy who were saying during this time period, if you make commander, you may as well get your divorce because you're going to go to sea for 4 years. The Navy had gone from 930 combatant ships during the Vietnam War down to 479 precipitously at the same time that our country had assumed the obligations in the Indian Ocean and the Persian Gulf, obligations that it had not had before. The Soviet Union, it's kind of hard to remember right now, was in a state of high activity diplomatically and militarily. It had invaded Afghanistan, threatening instability in that part of the world. It had a massive naval buildup in the Pacific following our withdrawal from Vietnam. Our diplomatic and military personnel in Tehran had been taken hostage by the Iranian regime and were being taunted daily on TV. Our national self-image was in a crisis state. Who were we as a country? Did we really have a future? And Ronald Reagan campaigned based on our national greatness and on the intrinsic good of our society and on restoring our place at the top of the world community. I can vividly remember in the summer of 1980 when Ronald Reagan made a speech at the Veterans of Foreign Wars Convention and just mentioned, as he was so wont to do with symbolic phrases, that Vietnam had been a noble cause. He had the media following him around the country, mocking the comment at this point, only 5 years after the fall of South Vietnam. But for those of us who had stepped forward and served in order to attempt to bring democracy to South Vietnam, that was a great moment of inspiration. Once he was elected, Ronald Reagan governed with the same sense of certainty about the greatness of our system and the goodness of our people. He convinced strong, talented people to join his administration. With George Shultz as Secretary of State and Cap Weinberger as Secretary of Defense, he brought two lions into his cabinet who didn't always agree, which was rather famous in Washington at the time, but who were able to combine fierce, competitive intellects with decades of valuable experience. And when Ronald Reagan left the White House, our military had been rebuilt, our people had regained their pride in our country and in their optimism for its future. The United States was again recognized as the leading nation in the world community, and the failed governmental concept that had produced the Soviet Union was on the verge of imploding, not because of external attack, but soon to disappear at the hands of its own citizens who could look to the West and see a better way of life. To paraphrase an old saying, you never know when you're making history, you only know when you did. And Mr. President, Ronald Reagan did make history, and I was proud to be a small part of it. And with that, I yield the floor and suggest the absence of a quorum.
Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Akaka.
The Senate today resumes consideration of the FAA reauthorization bill dealing with Federal Aviation Administration programs, including modernizing the air traffic control system. They're waiting for senators to come to the floor to speak. Earlier today, West Virginia's Senator Jay Rockefeller urged Democrats to come to the floor and speak about proposed amendments. He said, quote, Democrats aren't coming forward with them. He added that Republicans have come forward with their amendments, but Democrats, quote, really aren't doing our part. That from Jay Rockefeller of West Virginia. His colleague, Senator Joe Manchin, the freshman senator from that state, will be making his maiden floor speech. That is set for about 3 o'clock this afternoon. You've also heard some speeches throughout the afternoon in a recognition of the centennial of Ronald Reagan's birthday, which is February 6th, and possible more speeches on that as well. Now, the U.S. House is out this week. They will return on Tuesday at 2 p.m. Eastern. But today, Budget Committee Chairman in the House, Paul Ryan, released a fiscal 2011 budget allocation that would cap spending at just over $1 trillion and cut about $32 billion from the current government spending levels for this year. Again, the House out until next Tuesday.
Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent to suspend the quorum call.
Without objection, so ordered.
Mr. President, as the junior senator representing the state of Illinois and one who will lead a celebration of President Reagan's life in Chicago Saturday night for Sunday, the 100th birthday of our native Illinoisan, the 40th President Ronald Reagan, I want to talk for a moment about his life and what he has meant to the United States now on the 100th anniversary of President Reagan's birth. February 6, 1911, in Tampico, Illinois, with a population of 820, John and Nellie Reagan welcomed a child who would one day change the direction not just of our country but the world. According to the Reagan family lore, when he first gazed upon his son, John Reagan prophetically quipped, "He looks like a fat little Dutchman, but who knows, one day he may grow up to be president someday." His father was a strong believer in the American dream, and Nellie Reagan passed on to her son her penchant to always look for the good in people, regardless of their current position. It was those early lessons in perseverance and faith that would inspire Ronald Reagan to pursue his dream of becoming a Hollywood actor. He signed his first professional acting contract in 1935 and went on to enjoy a successful career on the silver screen. But by 1946, after serving 3 years in the Army Air Force Intelligence Corps during the height of World War II, he began to have ambitions beyond Hollywood. A 5-year stint as the president of the Screen Actors Guild laid the foundation for Ronald Reagan's political career. During the turmoil of the Hollywood communism craze, Reagan proved himself to be a skilled deal maker and an influential leader as he successfully navigated the upheaval in the Hollywood community. In 1964, Ronald Reagan was thrust into the national spotlight as he gave his televised speech entitled "A Time for Choosing" in support of the presidential nominee Barry Goldwater. Following his speech, a group of influential citizens became convinced that Ronald Reagan should become the next governor of California. After winning a primary and enduring a very hard-fought campaign, Ronald Reagan unseated the two-time governor of California, Pat Brown, to become the 33rd governor in California's history. During his 2 terms as governor, Californians enjoyed a smaller, less costly, and more efficient state government. Governor Reagan returned $5 billion to the taxpayers and used his line item veto authority 943 times to ensure that the state's budget matched its priorities. Ronald Reagan had once again proved himself a determined and capable leader in difficult times. But soon, the American people would learn that his best days were very much ahead of him. After an unsuccessful Republican presidential attempt in 1976, he knew that he wanted to be president, but would only enter the race if the people of the United States actually wanted him to run. In the years following the 76 primary, Ronald Reagan became increasingly concerned about the direction that the country was headed, especially in the areas of national security, unemployment, and the economy. More than anything, Reagan sensed that Americans had lost their sense of confidence, not just in themselves, but also in the country. Interestingly, the concerns Mr. Reagan felt as he weighed the decision to run for president are not unlike many of the challenges we face today. Ronald Reagan was confident that he was the man who could lead the country out of a dark recession and into the light of a new prosperity and national pride. After winning a landslide election in November, Ronald Reagan was sworn in as our 40th president on January 20th, 1981. He immediately went to work on repairing a broken economy by enacting the Economic Recovery Tax Act of 1981, with his solemn belief being that if people had more money in their pockets and confidence to invest, the country would get back on a sound financial footing. During his first months in office, Reagan was as much thankful for the newfound economic stability as he was for a heightened sense of optimism that was returning to the United States after very hard times. He thoughtfully guided this country through a series of national tragedies and terrorist attacks on our military forces abroad. Yet through it all, President Reagan's resolve never wavered. His confidence in the American people would meet the challenges of the times they faced without faltering. He was a man who, after surviving his own assassination attempt, continued to meet with congressional leaders in his hospital bed as he recovered because he believed it was best and in the interest of the American people to continue to work as he healed. It was that type of steadfast determination that allowed negotiations with Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev to move forward and eventually led to the tearing down of the Berlin Wall, the signing of the INF Treaty, and eventually the end of Soviet oppression of Eastern Europe. The issue that got him into politics, ending the spread of communism, became the crowning achievement of Ronald Reagan's presidency. His constant refrain throughout this time in the White House was that government was becoming too big, too inefficient, too unresponsive, and too wasteful. As governor, Reagan demonstrated the ability to exercise fiscal restraint as he urged leaders in Congress to do the same thing. I think it's appropriate that we are celebrating Ronald Reagan's 100th birthday at a time when the national debt and deficit are at an all-time high. We know that Ronald Reagan possessed the willingness to tackle such tough issues, and I believe that the lesson that we can learn most from his presidency is the endlessly optimistic attitude that he had for the United States, for its people, and himself would one day emerge stronger than any of the difficulties he had to overcome. His assertion was that America was, quote, a shining city on a hill, unquote. It guided him as it should guide us. A hard-nosed and gritty politician, Reagan would have jumped at the chance to take the responsibility of leading the country out of a very dark recession, as he did in 1981. So as we celebrate Ronald Reagan's 100th birthday, let us take a moment to reflect on the life of a man who, as president, always did what was necessary to move the country forward in a way that was most beneficial to his people. Now, I know his legacy is most associated with the people of California, but as the junior senator for Illinois, we will claim our right to note his birth in Tampico, his childhood in Dixon, and his college years at Eureka College. We will be very happy to mark the 100th birthday on Saturday in Chicagoland and through celebrations in other parts of the state. One of our great presidents who very much changed the course of the direction of this country and this world for the better. And with that, Mr. President, I yield back.